Little phrase that you might hear on occasion is, we're going to give something the acid test. Have you ever heard that phrase before? That phrase comes from back in the gold rush days. I know this is hard to believe, but people would try to fool other people into thinking something was gold that was not. Can you believe that? And con them into buying something, con them into buying a mine that was full of pyrite or whatever they call that stuff, and so forth. So they had to come up with a way to see that something was gold. And I know we've all watched some of those old, well, probably not anymore because the Westerns are kind of a thing gone by. But they used to have, and the guy would always bite it, and see if it left a mark with his teeth and so forth. Well, what they actually did with this, they take the gold or whatever it was that the person had that looked like shiny gold. And there's a couple of different metals apparently that can present themselves as gold, at least in the rock there. And they would take this black piece of, I think it was flint, and they would scratch it with that, and there would be a line of gold there, and then they would pour this acid on it. And if it was gold, the gold would stay there. If it was something else, the acid would take it off. All right? And it was called the acid test to see if something is genuine. All right? What's real? What's genuine? All right? Sometimes you don't have to have you can have the imitation. All right? Let me give you an example. You can have, sitting on the registers there, we have some kind of no-name tissue, all right? As opposed to having to have Kleenex. You can get away with that, right? Okay, you can maybe have whoever's brand that is, You can have Life Brand instead of Tylenol. Probably works pretty much the same. You can have Barks as opposed to A&W. But you should have the A&W root beer because that is the best. All right, let's take a quick vote. A&W root beer, Barks, no name. Martha, you like Barks? Because Barks has bite, right? Okay, no. But can you imagine trying to propose to your lovely with a beautiful cubic zirconia? Probably wouldn't fly too well. All right, or selling a mine full of fool's gold. Or as the man that we're going to look at tonight in 2 Kings chapter 1, Ahaziah tried to replace God with Baal. Tried to replace God with Baal. Take your Bibles, come with me to 2 Kings chapter 1. Ahaziah, we haven't heard of Ahaziah yet, but Ahaziah was Ahab's son, and we know who Ahab was. He was a terrible king. As a matter of fact, God puts in his word that he was worse than all the kings before him. All right? I believe he was the 7th king of the divided kingdom, and he did all kinds of evil, vile things. All right? And his wife was even worse than he was, and Jezebel, and bringing in Baal worship and promoting that Baal worship. But Ahab dies, and Ahaziah, his son, assumes the throne, and he only has the throne for a couple of years. All right? Just to kind of give you a little spoiler alert that he's not going to make it very far into our book of 2 Kings before he's gone. But he was up in his room somehow or other, and it talks about there's some lattice there. Lattice is that crisscrossy stuff that you can see through, and somehow or other he must have been leaning on it or whatever, and he fell through this lattice, and he was very, very badly injured. And it was to the point where he thought that, I don't know, I might die from these injuries. So what he did, take a look at chapter 1, verse number 2. It says, and Ahaziah fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber and was in Samaria and was sick. And he sent his messengers and said unto them, and this is what I want you to see. Go inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. The question is, the first question that kind of comes to mind is, why would he have his servants travel 60 kilometers to another country, to another city there, the Ekron, which belongs to the Philistines? There's the 5 lords of the Philistines. They had these Ekron and Gath, and there was a few other ones there. And why would he send them there to inquire of Beelzebub, Baal, when he had Baal prophets in his kingdom? All right. Now we do understand that there was the big battle on Carmel with Elijah, and Elijah had the 450 prophets of Baal killed. But that was 10 years ago or more. And Jezebel was still alive at that time, and she'd have brought more Baal prophets back in. So why would he send them off to go to another place to get to these Baal prophets? Well, there's a couple of ideas there. I know that if something happens, or at least I can't say that I know this, all right? But from all the movies that I've seen, right? And we know how true movies are, all right? But at any rate, if something happens to the leader, they don't want other people to know if he's on his deathbed, because it could do all kinds of crazy things to the country, all right? So maybe Ahaziah is thinking, I don't want the rest of the people to know that I'm not even sure if I'm going to live or die here, okay? That's a possibility. Or it's also possible that because in Ekron was the main worship for Baal, it had this beautiful, huge temple. It was very famous for that, and maybe the priests or the prophets that were at this temple were better than the prophets that he had. I don't know, okay? But he sends these guys. He says, I want you to go, and I want you to find out, ask them whether or not I am going to get better. Look at what he says there. Go inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. Doesn't that seem kind of funny? If I'm going to go to God, the real God, am I going to ask him if I'm going to get better, or am I going to ask him, can you heal me? But he's got this wimpy little Baal god that can't do anything. Just ask him if I'm going to recover, okay? So he sends these guys over there, and God comes to Elijah. Elijah the Tishbite. He is a rough guy. He is a rough prophet. Maybe a bit scary-looking guy, okay, and not dressed in fancy schmancy clothes or anything like that, okay? And God tells Elijah, he says, go intercept those messengers and tell those messengers, you go back and you tell the king, why are you sending people to Beelzebub when there is a God in Israel? So the messengers, they turn around and they go back to the king, and the king says, well, what are you doing here? I mean, I just sent you. There's no way you went all the way there and back, okay? What are you doing? They said, well, we ran into this man, and this is what he said. And they quote it basically word for word. Let's look at verses 3 and verse 4. This is the original thing there, and then they come back there again. It says, but the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say unto them, is it not because there is not a God in Israel that ye go to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not come down from that bed in which thou art gone up, but thou shalt surely die. And Elijah departed. And they went, and if you were to read on, almost word for word, they say this to the king, all right? And the king asked them, he says, well, who was this guy? Who is this person? And they didn't know who Elijah was. He said, well, what did he look like? They said, well, he was a hairy guy, and he had a big leather girdle on, and Ahaziah knew exactly who he was. Ahaziah said, that's Elijah the Tishbite. You know what it reminds me of? In Matthew chapter 3, verse 4, I'll pop that one up on the screen there for you. It says, and the same John, talking about John the Baptist, had his raiment of camel's hair and a leather girdle about his loins, and his meat was locust and wild honey. And it tells us in Luke chapter 1 and verse 17, it says, and he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias, or Elijah, okay? And it says, here's this guy, all right? And immediately, Ahaziah knew who it was. He'd heard from his father. Maybe he had seen some other things like that, but he knew exactly who he was. So what does Ahaziah do? What should have Ahaziah done? When he heard that, you know what, I should have gone to God, it should have humbled him and got him on his knees, and he should have repented, but it did not. You know why? He's the king. He's the king. And he's not going to be pushed around by some ragtag, rough-looking guy who doesn't even wear nice clothes out in the woods. He's not going to be pushed around by him. So you know what he does? He says, I want to have Elijah come here. Now, there's a couple of possibilities maybe of why he did that. Maybe he's going to try to bribe him. It's a possibility. I'll bribe him so that I can change my sentence. Or I think it's more likely thinking that I'm going to kill him, and then if I kill him, it won't happen to me. Like that's got anything to do with the other. But nonetheless, he decides he's going to order Elijah to come to him. Verse 15, if we were to look at there, it kind of alludes to the fact that Elijah's life would be in danger if he went with these people. But so what he does is he orders his men, all right? He orders his men. He says, then, verse 9, it says, and then the king sent unto him a captain of 50 with his 50. And he went up to him, and behold, he sat on the top of a hill, and he spake unto him, Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down. All right? Now, we understand here, when they're talking here, when they say, Thou man of God, this is a term that was used quite commonly, just speaking of a prophet. They're not coming to him with any respect. All right? They're not coming to him saying, that you are a man of God, and not like Nicodemus came, when Nicodemus came by night in John chapter 3 to Jesus, and he said, Master, we know that you are from God, for no man can do the things that you do, and so forth. That's not what these guys are saying. All right? They're coming to him, and they're saying that he's a prophet, but then they're ordering him. Okay? They're ordering him. He says, Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down. You know what he's saying? I represent the king, and I'm telling you to come down, and we're going to see the king. There's no respect here. All right? Understand that. These guys think that they've got it all because they've been handed a little bit of authority, and he's got 50 guys that are under him, and they've come here, and there's Elijah. Remember we saw Elijah when Jezebel sent that note and said, by tomorrow this time, I'm going to have you be just like those prophets that you killed, and Elijah ran away? That's not Elijah now. Elijah's sitting up on top of this hill, and I can picture him. This isn't what he's really doing, but I just picture him filing his fingernails and saying to them this. Right? I'm sure that's not really what he was doing, but as he's there, he's not fazed at all. Okay, I don't think he's raising his voice. I think it says that he's just sitting on the top of this hill, and they say, Thou man of God, the king has said, Come down, come on. And there's Elijah. If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and burn you and your 50 guys. What do you mean? The fire came down. Nuked them all. Word gets back to the king. The king is so concerned about his 51 men that have just died. He says, 51 more, off you go, and tell them to come. He sends another 51 guys. Look at verse 11. Again also he sent unto him another captain of 50 with his 50. And he answered and said unto him, O man of God, thus saith the king, or thus hath the king said, Come down quickly. Get up and come down. You're coming with us now. All right? You come down quickly. You know what Elijah says? If I'm really a man of God, let fire come down and burn you guys up. And guess what happened? You got it. Fire come down. We have 102 toasted soldiers at the bottom of this hill. This barely phases Ahaziah. You know what he does? He sends 51 more. It's like, I got millions. I'll just keep sending them. All right? And he sends 51 more. These guys, all right, why would Elijah have these men killed? Does it seem cruel that Elijah is having these men killed? I mean, after all, are they not just following orders? To a certain extent, yes, they are following orders, all right? They are following orders. But you know what? These people had forgotten what happened on Mount Carmel. You know, these aren't Syrians or something like that are coming here. You know these 102 men are? They're Israelites. They're Israelites that should know who God is. And they have turned their back on God, and they are representing this vile, wicked king, and they are proud to do it. You come down. Right now, we're going. You think you're a man of God? Understand this, too, that what Elijah is doing here, Elijah doesn't have special powers that he can call God, that God is at his beck and call, and whatever Elijah says, God does. All right? That's not it. What's happening here is this is ordained of God, what Elijah is doing. Just like God told Elijah before, he says, you go and you intercept these messengers, and this is the message you give them. Obviously, God had told Elijah what was happening here. And he sat there, and so as this third group comes along here, before this third group gets there, all right, as I said, do you remember that the people had forgotten about Carmel? Do you remember what the people said? Do you remember what the people said? Probably at least 1,500, maybe 2,000 Israelites that were in position of authority when God had Elijah up on the top of Mount Carmel, and he had the sacrifice that was there, and he made fun of the prophets of Baal who had worked all afternoon and all day, all morning and afternoon to try to get their imaginary pretend little Baal god to answer with fire. And of course he could not do it because he's imaginary and pretend. All right? And then when Elijah was there and he asked God, you know what, if you look at that carefully, and I think it's kind of funny that if you read that passage carefully, he doesn't even ask God for the fire. But God sends the fire and burns that up. And the people, with like all at once, all of these people humbled themselves before God. They recognized who God was and the fact that they had turned their backs on God. And they said, the Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. And they recognized who He was. You know what? The people had forgotten. It was 10 years ago. These soldiers came, and they didn't even know, they didn't give two hoots about who is God. They just wanted to follow their little king Ahaziah. God had no problem dropping the fire on the sacrifice at Carmel. And you know what? He is still the same God who proved Himself with fire at this hill. Point number one. Understand this, point number one. God is God. The only true God. That's who we get to serve. The only true God. Ahaziah didn't care about those men. He sends again, the 102 are dead. He sends another 51. But they come. Let's look at me at verse 13. And it says, and he sent again a captain of the third 50 with his 50. And the third captain of his 50 went up and came and fell on his knees before Elijah and besought him and said unto him, O man of God. Same words that these other guys use, this O man of God, but in a different tone. They're using it as just kind of a title and a mocking title. This man is not doing it, and I'll show you that as we see some other words that he said. He is saying, O man of God, I pray thee, let my life and the life of these 50 thy servants be precious in thy sight. You know what he's saying? He is saying that he is coming humbly before him. It's not just that he's afraid to die, although I think that's a huge part of it, all right? But he recognizes who this man is. O thou man of God. And he says, we are your servants. All right? He's coming to him recognizing that these other two captains came and they were ambassadors, they were representatives of Ahaziah. This guy comes and he recognizes that Elijah is a representative of God. And he says, O thou man of God. And you know what happens? The angel of the Lord in verse 15 says, and they said unto Elijah, go down with them, be not afraid of them. And he arose and went down with them unto the king. I want you to see point number 2 this afternoon. God extends grace to the humble. These men humbled themselves before Elijah, before God, and God extends grace to the humble. James chapter 4 verse 10 says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. And I do this a lot, and you have to forgive me, all right? I might say, this is one of my favorite passages. This is one of my favorite prayers. This is one of my favorite people. And then I get reading my Bible, and then there's another one that's now my favorite one for a little while. And then I'll read some more, and another guy will be my favorite for a little while. Yep. This is a beautiful book, my friends. Beautiful book. But I'm gonna preface that with that, and you know it'll change. But nonetheless, here we go. One of my favorite prayers in the Bible is given by Solomon. And then God answers that prayer when they dedicate the temple. Come with me, if you will, please, here to 2 Chronicles chapter 7. It's not far from 1 Kings. Next one is 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. This is God's answer, almost kind of, it's kind of the reciprocal answer of what Solomon's prayer was. And in chapter 7 and verse 14, God says, if my people, these people that just got killed, these 102 soldiers that got burnt up were God's people, all right? But they did not humble themselves. But he says here, if my people, which are called by my name, look at these next three words, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, here's the promise, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. But you know what was key these people had to do? They had to humble themselves. You know what happens if you want to accept Christ as your Savior? What you have to first of all do is you have to humble yourself before God. You have to realize that me standing before God, I fall short of who He is. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I don't measure up to God. And I have to humble myself and before God and in order to get saved, and I've already done that many, many years ago, but in order to get saved, you have to humble yourself before God, recognizing who He is and His grandeur and who you are in your tininess and insufficiency and how He is all-sufficient, and humble ourselves and recognize we aren't on the same level. A lot of people want to make it, well, yeah, God's my buddy. No. God's not your buddy. He says He's closer than a friend. All right? That's talking about a partner relationship there. But that's not, we are nowhere near the same level as God. We have to humble ourselves before Him. A Christian can only be blessed when he walks humbly before God. You know why? Because God holds all this together. In Colossians chapter 1 and verse 17, it says, and He is before all things, and by Him all things consist. You know what that means? God holds us, this planet, everything around us together with His power. That's how much bigger He is than we are. All right? And we need to humble ourselves. And that's what this one soldier did. He came and he begged him and he says, I pray you, you man of God, and we are your servants. He's a soldier with all the the sword, the spear, the whatever else he's got. Okay? But no. He's coming to this man and he's saying, we are your servants. He's humbling himself, and God honors that. Humility reflects our dependence upon the only true God. Humility puts God in His right place and puts us in our right place. But only through humility. Only through humility. Elijah goes with these soldiers and he confronts Ahaziah face to face, and he tells him, you're going to die. Verse 16, back in 2 Kings 1. And he said unto him, thus saith the Lord. So this is the third time that this is spoken. Elijah says it to the messengers. The messengers tell it to Ahaziah, and now the messengers these soldiers bring Elijah before Ahaziah, and Elijah repeats this again to him. He says, thus saith the Lord, for as much as thou hast sent messengers to inquire of Beelzebub, the god, notice it's little wee tiny g. It's too bad they couldn't make the print even smaller, just to kind of emphasize it, The god of Ekron, is it not because there is no God in Israel to inquire of His word? Therefore thou shalt not come down off that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. You know what happened to him? Next three words. So he died, according to the word of the Lord which Elijah had spoken. And he did evil things. But he didn't come down from that room. Well, his body did, but he didn't. All right? Does it seem like pretty stiff punishment just because of what he did? All he did was send some messengers. Does that sound like pretty stiff punishment that he's going to die for that? Understand point number 3 tonight. The more influence we have, the more responsibility we bear. And Ahaziah, he knew about Elijah. He knew about the battle on the top of Mount Carmel. He was able to identify him. Ahaziah got the warning from his servants, but instead of repenting, he let his pride lift him up and say, he is going to answer to me, and I'm going to bring Elijah before me. His sin is particularly serious because his dismissal of God would lead others away from God. His dismissal of God went right through on those first 102 soldiers that came there, as they came and said, "Oh, thou man of God, get down now." Because that's what their king had told them. And because of the position that he had, the more influence we have, the more responsibility that we bear. Now, none of us in this room are kings. If you are, you kind of fooled me. Just thought of this. I went away on a missions trip years ago, and I've shared this with some of you before. I was up in Ottawa, and we were putting in a foundation for a church, and I got to stay in some people's house. These people were from Cameroon, Africa, and they were both doctors. His name was Moses. Her name was Elizabeth. And I'm trying to make small talk conversation with them, all right? And they would answer me with one word, and I got to come up with another long sentence, ask a question, yes. Okay. No. And then I come up with something. So I thought, I got it. You know, how many siblings do you have back home? Oh. And Elizabeth had 8 or 9 brothers and sisters back home. And then I turned to Moses. I said, how about you? How many siblings do you have at home? Over 100. My father was a king, and he had many wives. And I just about fell over like, where do you go with small talk from there when this guy's father was a king and I'm staying in his house? But I'm pretty sure none of you are kings. But you know what? You have responsibility over someone. And the more influence that we have, the more responsibility that we bear. Then, you have responsibility for your wife. You have a responsibility to protect your wife, to provide for your wife, to help your wife. They're your responsibility. Parents, you have responsibility for your children. And what we do influences what they do and who they are. Employers, you have responsibility to your employees. You have a responsibility to be a Christian employer. And when sometimes you have to do things that are right that cost more money than it would if you were to do it like everybody else, doesn't matter. You're responsible to God, before God, and for your employees. What about kids? You know what? You're responsible for your friends. You're responsible for your friends. Those friends that you know that don't know Christ as their Savior, you know what? God has put them in your life so that you can tell them, like Martha was saying, you can tell them about Jesus. And whatever influence you have, the more influence you have, the more responsibility that you bear. That's just the rules. King Ahaziah had great responsibility. He's the king over the whole country. And what was he doing? He was mocking God and saying, you know what, I don't need God. God's here. They're in the chosen land, right? This is a chosen people. But we're going to go to the Philistines and their piddly little god and Ekron, and we're going to ask there. And because he snubbed God, God says, no. You're not going to snub me. And he brings in Elijah. Rough, gruff-looking guy, big leather girdle, hair all over the place. I can picture him. All right. It's interesting that Elisha, his sidekick, was bald. And some kids one day decided to pick on him, and they said, "Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." And Elisha turned, and two bears come running out of the woods and demoed 42 kids. I think they weren't, I don't think they were kids. I think they were probably teens that were mocking what happens to Elijah, which we get to look at next week, and then we can't look at him anymore because he's gone. But we'll still look at him, okay? But it's one thing, let me leave you with this one thought. It is one thing to answer for what you do. And I think most of us, most people are quite willing to accept, if I've done something wrong, I can pay for what I've done wrong. But the fact of the matter is, we answer for how we influence someone else. It's more than just what I do affects more than just me. It affects other people. What I do, because you put me in as your pastor, affects you. That's a responsibility that God's given me, all right? It's scary. It's scary. But you have responsibility. Ahaziah had a responsibility, and he, through his pride, says, "You know what? I don't care about God. I'm the king. Bring that hairy dude down here, and I'm going to put him in his place." Didn't happen. Didn't happen. He didn't get out of his place. He died there. Because the more influence we have, the more responsibility that we bear. And you know what? Don't forget the second point. God extends his grace to the humble. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. We serve an awesome God. We have the privilege to serve an awesome God. And he warns us with things and explains some things in his word. That's why why he records some of this. It's not just history. It is history, but it's not just history. It's there to teach us some things about God. As Brother Ian was talking about, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And first thing people need to do is they need to know to get saved. So book of John and the book of Romans work great for that. But then they need to learn about who Jesus was. But the fact is, 3/4 of your Bible is Old Testament too. And it's things there to teach us about the character of God, all right, and who he is and what we can do to please him. That's why he records it for us, so that we're not walking blind into this. And that's why it's important that we spend time, like Chloe said, reading our Bibles to understand who God is, all right, and what it is that we need to do and how we need to answer to him. But we need to be humble before him. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Let's pray. Precious Father, I thank you